There is a quote I keep coming back to. A wealthy man, one of the richest in Chicago, standing outside his own mansion and staring across the street at his neighbor's new home. According to the neighbor's wife, who recorded it in her journal, George Pullman said he did not know what he had ever done to have that thing staring him in the face every time he went out of his door. That thing was a house, not some crumbling eyesore, not a factory or a warehouse. A brand new private residence, built with Massachusetts granite, designed by the finest architect in America. And the man who lived inside it was no outsider. John Jacob Glessner was a fellow millionaire. His firm would soon merge into International Harvester, the fourth largest corporation in the country. He belonged on this street. His house did not. What Pullman saw from his doorstep was something Chicago had never seen before. A wall, flat, heavy, almost windowless. No columns, no carved trim, no grand staircase leading to the entrance. Just stone. The newspapers called it a fortress. Some called it a jail. One critic called it a gargantuan freak. But the architect who designed it called it his favorite house. The one building out of everything he had ever created where he would have chosen to live. He never got the chance. He was dead before the family moved in. This is a story about a house that was hated by the people who saw it from the outside and loved by everyone who stepped through its door. It is the story of the street where Chicago's wealthiest families once lived shoulder to shoulder and what happened when that street fell apart around them. And it is the story of a daughter who grew up inside these walls, was denied an education by her own father, and went on to become the mother of forensic science by building miniature crime scenes out of dollhouse furniture. What struck me about this house is how everything circles back to that same tension. The outside versus the inside. What people assumed versus what was actually there. That pattern runs through the architecture, the family, the neighborhood, and the woman who emerged from it. This is Glessner House. Chapter 1. The Architect Racing Death. Henry Hobson Richardson weighed somewhere around 350 pounds. He wore bright yellow vests. He threw dinner parties that ran late into the night. The story goes that 3 of his junior architects once tried on his overcoat at the same time, and all 3 fit inside it. The man was enormous in every sense, and the buildings he made were no different. He was born in 1838 on a plantation in Louisiana. His great-grandfather was Joseph Priestley, the chemist usually credited with the discovery of oxygen. Richardson grew up speaking French, which served him well when he enrolled at Harvard, and later became only the second American ever admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The Civil War stranded him in France. His family's fortune collapsed with the Confederacy. He stayed in Paris, took a job in an architectural firm, and waited. When he finally returned to the United States in 1865, he had virtually nothing except connections. But those connections ran deep. His classmates at Harvard included some of the wealthiest men in the Northeast, and they started hiring him almost immediately. His neighbor on Staten Island happened to be Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park. The two became close friends and collaborators. What Richardson built over the next 2 decades had no real precedent in America. He looked at the heavy stone walls and rounded arches of medieval Romanesque churches. Then he stripped them down, removed the fussy decoration, made the forms broader, heavier, more muscular. He applied this language not just to churches, but to libraries, train stations, courthouses, and private homes. Critics eventually stopped trying to categorize it and simply named it after him, Richardsonian Romanesque. By 1885, a poll of 75 American architects named 5 of his buildings among the 10 finest in the country. Trinity Church in Boston took first place with 84% of the vote. Richardson was 47 years old and untouchable. He was also dying. Bright's disease. Chronic kidney failure. It had been with him for years, slowing him down, swelling his body, stealing his energy. In his final months, he kept working at a pace that alarmed everyone around him. He had commissions rising in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. He told visitors to his studio that there was no man in the world who enjoyed life while it lasted as much as he did. It was during this period that John Glessner walked into his office. Glessner was a farm equipment executive from Chicago who wanted a new house on Prairie Avenue, the most exclusive residential street in the city. Richardson visited the Glessners in their current home on West Washington Street. During that visit, he noticed a photograph hanging on the wall. It showed the medieval outbuildings of Abingdon Abbey in England. Richardson studied it. He reportedly told Glessner he could build something from that image, something unlike anything on Prairie Avenue. Glessner asked if he was serious. Richardson said yes. Then he went home and got sicker. By March of 1886, tonsillitis hit him on top of the kidney disease. On April 27th, he died in his home in Brookline, Massachusetts. He left behind a wife, 6 children, and almost nothing but debts. The house in Chicago was not yet finished. His firm, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge would oversee the final construction. But every essential line of the design had been drawn by Richardson himself. The granite was already arriving from Braggville, Massachusetts. The foundation was in the ground. It would be his last completed house. And decades later, when architects and critics looked back on everything he had produced in his short career, many of them pointed to this final commission for a quiet businessman in Chicago as the one that mattered most. Richardson never saw a single room completed. Chapter 2. A Fortress on Millionaires' Row. Every house on Prairie Avenue faced the street the way a house was supposed to. Tall windows, carved facades, a wide staircase climbing to the front door so that anyone passing could admire what money had built. That was the deal on this particular block. You showed what you had. The Glessner building broke every part of that deal. Where neighbors presented 3 stories of ornamental brownstone, Richardson had given the Glessners a wall. Not a decorative wall, a working wall. Stone laid in horizontal courses of varying heights, sitting on a foundation of Illinois dolomite, with basement windows sealed behind granite grills. The north facade along 18th Street offered almost nothing to look at. No carvings, no flourishes, a single arched doorway. Even the entrance sat at ground level, no staircase. A visitor arriving for the first time might have mistaken the servants' door for the main one, because the service entrance was actually more prominent. The walls themselves were thinner than they appeared, 8 to 10 inches of granite concealing a structural wall of common brick behind it. The stone was theater. It performed weight and mass that the engineering did not require. Richardson understood that. He wanted the effect of a medieval compound without the medieval limitations. But here is what nobody walking along Prairie Avenue could see. Behind that wall, the house opened up. The plan wrapped around a private south-facing courtyard filled with light. The main rooms, the library, the parlor, the dining room, all looked inward onto this garden, rather than outward onto the street. Richardson had placed a long service corridor along the north side, directly against 18th Street, so that the noise, the wind, the dirt, and the cold were absorbed by the working half of the house before they could reach the family. It was a building that turned its back on Chicago and made a private world behind stone. The response was immediate. A reporter from the Chicago Herald visited during the final weeks of construction and described it as a queer house, calling it the Dutch house in the aristocratic precincts of Prairie Avenue. The journalist seemed genuinely confused by what Richardson and Glessner had tried to express. Other writers were less polite. The house had no curb appeal, and on a street where curb appeal was the entire point, this felt like an insult. The neighbors took it personally. George Pullman, whose mansion sat directly across Prairie Avenue in the ornate Second Empire style, went further than complaining. According to one account, he convinced his friend William Kimball to purchase the lot between his property and the Glessners' house. Pullman reportedly even suggested the architect, Solon Beeman, to make certain the new building would suit his taste. The Kimball house went up in 1892. It was everything the Glessner house was not. Decorative, vertical, traditional. A wall between Pullman and the thing he could not stand to look at. But not everyone on the street agreed. Frances Glessner recorded the reactions carefully in her journal. and some were enthusiastic. A Miss Montague told her she had never seen so splendid a house. A Dr. Adams said he liked it exceedingly. These voices were quieter, but they were there. And there were other voices too, professional ones. Architects who walked past the house and recognized what Richardson had actually done. They did not see an eyesore. They saw a provocation, a question about what a home in a city was supposed to be. Those architects would carry that question forward for the next 100 years, but that is a later chapter. Chapter 3. Dynamite on Desplaines Street. On Thanksgiving Day, 1884, the families of Prairie Avenue sat down to dinner behind locked doors. Outside, a column of workers marched slowly past their homes. The International Working People's Association had organized what they called a Poor People's March, and the route was deliberate. They walked directly past the mansions of the men who employed them, stopping in front of certain houses to shout at the walls. Nobody broke a window, but the message carried. The wealthiest families in Chicago could hear the anger on the other side of their front doors, and for some of them, it was the first time the labor crisis had shown up on their own block. It was somewhere in this climate that Richardson first met with the Glessners to discuss their new house. Just weeks earlier, the opening gala for Chicago's new Board of Trade building had been disrupted by another workers' march, redirected by police only blocks from the banquet. The city was wound tight, and when Richardson's design began to take shape, with its heavy face turned toward the street and almost nothing visible from the sidewalk, people assumed they understood why. They were wrong about the reason, but they were not wrong about the fear. On May 3, 1886, striking workers clashed with police outside the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company on Chicago's South Side. Officers fired into the crowd. At least 2 workers were killed, possibly more. A flyer went out that night calling for a mass rally. The headline read, "Working Men to Arms." The rally gathered on Desplaines Street near Haymarket Square the following evening. Somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people showed up. For most of the night, things stayed calm. Mayor Carter Harrison came in person to observe, and left when the crowd began thinning in the rain. Then about 175 police officers marched in with an order to disperse. Someone, never identified, threw a homemade dynamite bomb into their ranks. Officer Matthias Dagan died almost immediately. In the darkness and panic, police opened fire. Some officers reportedly shot at their own men. By the end of the night, 7 officers were dead or dying. At least 4 civilians were killed. Dozens more on both sides were wounded. John and Frances Glessner were at home that evening. The new house on Prairie Avenue was still under construction. According to one account, they could hear the explosion and gunfire from where they sat. On at least one previous occasion, Glessner had reportedly drawn a revolver on an intruder who had broken into that same home. This was not abstract for them. 8 men were arrested and charged with murder. Not because any of them had thrown the bomb, but because their speeches and writings were deemed to have incited the violence. 4 were hanged. 1 killed himself in his cell the night before execution. The bomber was never found. Less than a month after the explosion, on June 1st, 1886, construction began on the Glessner house. Almost immediately, a Chicago newspaper connected the dots. The Evening Journal reported that the building was being put up in anticipation of the day when the rich would have to keep out of the way of anarchists. The journalist added that the real purpose was privacy and novelty, but the anarchist line was the one that stuck. For decades, people repeated it as fact. A rich man had built himself a bunker because the workers were coming. The timeline says otherwise. Richardson had completed the drawings in 1885. He presented them well before the McCormick killings, before the rally, before the bomb. He died on April 27, 1886, exactly 1 week before Haymarket. The house that people believed was a reaction to political violence had been conceived by a man who never lived to see the violence at all. Richardson designed the house the way he did because of a photograph of an English abbey, a narrow urban lot, and a family that wanted warmth and privacy more than they wanted to impress their neighbors. The blank face toward the street was not a barricade against revolution. It was a choice about where to put the sunlight. But Chicago in 1886 was not interested in that explanation. The city had just watched a bomb tear through a line of police officers. It needed the house to mean something else. Chapter 4. Behind the Granite. On the 1st of December, 1887, the Glessner family moved in. Someone carried a coal scuttle from the old house on West Washington Street, still holding live embers from the final fire. Those embers lit the first fire in the new one. It was a small act, but it said something about what this house was meant to be. Not a showpiece. A home. The parlor held no ballroom. On a street where neighbors hosted hundreds beneath crystal chandeliers, the Glessners entertained in a room centered on a Steinway grand piano. Frances had wanted an upright. John overruled her and ordered what he called the finest piano that could be made. Theodore Thomas, founding conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, traveled to the Steinway factory in New York to play the instrument and approve it before it shipped. The case was then sent to A.H. Davenport in Boston, where a designer named Francis Bacon built a custom enclosure inlaid with mother-of-pearl in various woods. The finished piano cost $1,500 and weighed 900 pounds. It arrived on December 23rd. A Christmas present that required several men to carry through the door. The room around it was just as deliberate. The walls were covered not in wallpaper but in hand-painted canvas by an artist named William Prettyman. Morris and Company silks hung at the windows. There was a built-in banquette for listeners. Everything in the room served the music. Frances Glessner had spent years studying the English arts and crafts movement, and when the time came to furnish the new house, she made choices that had nothing to do with what was fashionable on Prairie Avenue. She selected wallpapers, textiles, and rugs from William Morris, fireplace tiles from William de Morgan, glass by Emile Gallet, furniture built by A.H. Davenport to designs drawn in Richardson's own office. 7 different Morris wallpaper patterns went onto the walls of various rooms. The house today is believed to hold the largest collection of Morris products in any publicly accessible residence in the country. The library sat at the heart of daily life. A massive Parker desk filled the center of the room, designed so that John and Frances could sit facing each other while they worked. Nearly 3,000 books lined the shelves, many of them inscribed by the authors. 11 fireplaces warmed the house, and none of them were decorative. They burned. But the most revealing part of the floor plan was the space that visitors never saw. More than 60% of the 17,000 square feet was given over to the people who kept the household running. 8 servants lived in the house full-time. They had their own hallways, hidden behind the family rooms, so they could move from kitchen to bedroom to dining room without ever crossing the family's path. A tall standing screen concealed the servants' entrance to the dining room, so that even during meals, the staff appeared and disappeared without a visible door. What made this unusual, though, was not the separation. Wealthy families across America kept their servants out of sight. What made people talk was what the Glessners gave them. Every servant had a private room. Every room had a window that faced the courtyard. Every room had its own closet. These were not standard accommodations in 1887. On a street where other families housed their staff in windowless attics or basement quarters, the Glessners' arrangement struck some neighbors as excessive. Why would a cook need a view? Frances kept a separate ledger for the household staff. Each person's name, position, salary, and the reason they left or were let go. One of those servants, a cook named Mattie Williamson, stayed with the family for years. When the house was restored as a museum, her room was identified and personalized with photographs of her family. Between the children's bedrooms on the second floor, a hidden door connected Fanny's room to George's. It swung open through the shared wall, invisible from either side unless you knew where to press. The kind of detail that says more about a family than any architectural drawing. The house was wired for electricity when it was built, but no infrastructure existed yet to deliver power to the neighborhood. For the first 5 or 6 years, gas lamps lit the rooms. The full electrical system arrived just in time for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, when Chicago wanted to prove it had entered the modern age. As Frances reportedly put it, for all its granite, the home was wonderfully elastic. You could squeeze as many as you wanted into it. She was right. Over the next 50 years, the house absorbed orchestras, reading groups, Sunday suppers for unmarried friends, Harvard professors, and at least one guest who would go on to reshape the American landscape. Chapter 5. The Lives They Built. They met because he needed a place to sleep. In 1868, John Glessner was a 25-year-old from Zanesville, Ohio, 5 years into his career in the implement trade in Springfield. He rented a room from a local family named Macbeth. Their daughter, Frances, was 20. Over the next 2 years, he rose through the company, and their relationship grew alongside it. And in December of 1870, they married. They moved to Chicago 8 days later. Their first son, George, was born in October of 1871, a week before the Great Chicago Fire swept within a block of John's office. 3 years later, Frances gave birth to a second boy. They named him John Francis. He died at 8 months old. George, still a small child, asked that his baby brother's first name be added to his own. From that point on, he was John George Macbeth Glessner. They did not have another son. John built his career methodically. He had started at the bottom and worked his way to junior partner, then full partner, then sole vice president of what became Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner. By the turn of the century, he was at the center of negotiations that merged 5 rival manufacturers into one entity. International Harvester launched in 1902 with backing from J.P. Morgan and the McCormick and Deering families. John was named vice president and chairman of the executive committee. He stayed in that role for nearly 2 decades. But if John was the one who earned the money, Frances was the one who decided what it meant. She kept a journal for 40 years, more than 5,000 handwritten pages. When she was too ill to write, John picked up the pen and continued in her place. Those volumes recorded everything from what the family ate to who visited to what made her angry. When a neighbor, a Mrs. Clark, smoked a cigarette inside the house, Frances noted it as most disreputable. She co-founded the Chicago Chamber Music Society and belonged to the Fortnightly alongside Jane Addams and Bertha Palmer. When the president of the University of Chicago asked her in 1893 for advice on how to introduce faculty wives to the women of the city, Frances responded by launching her Monday morning reading class. It met every other Monday from October to May in the library. During the first hour, the women sewed, while a professional reader read aloud. During the second hour, there was music or a lecture. Attendance was by invitation only. The class ran for 37 years. Frances was also a silversmith. In 1904, she set up a workbench in the basement and began hammering bowls, pitchers, and salt cellars. She studied under Annibale Fogliata, a craftsman at Hull House, and Madeline Yale Wynne, one of the charter members of the Chicago Arts and Crafts Society. Her silver mark was a capital G encircling a honeybee, a nod to the hives she kept at the Rocks, the family's summer estate in New Hampshire's White Mountains. She reportedly knitted more than 500 sweaters over the course of her life, for her children, for the farm workers in New Hampshire, for servicemen during the First World War. The house on Prairie Avenue was never a passive backdrop. John once arranged for members of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to slip in through the servants' entrance and set up in the parlor. Frances walked in to find them playing. It was her birthday. On quieter evenings, the couple hosted Sunday suppers for unmarried friends, bringing together authors, artists, and musicians who might not otherwise have had a family table to sit at. Frederick Law Olmsted stayed in the guest room while he was in Chicago planning the grounds for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. His portrait hung on the wall of the house for the rest of the Glessners' lives. John served a term as president of the Commercial Club of Chicago, the same organization that later engaged Daniel Burnham to create the Plan of Chicago, the document that reshaped the city's waterfront, parks, and boulevards. He sat on the boards of Rush Medical College, the Art Institute, the Chicago Orphan Asylum, and the Citizens Association. He was not a man who made speeches or sought attention. Those close to him described a person whose intelligence had a profound, though barely visible effect on everything around him. Frances died on October 19, 1932. She was 84. John continued living in the house. alone now on a street that had lost nearly all of its original families. He died on January 20th, 1936. He was 92, a week short of his 93rd birthday. In his memoir, written years earlier, he had described his wife. She had a clean and wholesome and orderly mind, he wrote, a heart overflowing with love for family and friends and for all in any need. He did not write about himself. Chapter 6. The Blueprint They All Borrowed. Louis Sullivan saw it before anyone else. While the neighbors on Prairie Avenue were still complaining, Sullivan was studying the house from the street and understanding what Richardson had done. The heavy proportions, the refusal to decorate for the sake of decorating, the way the building sat on its lot as though it had always been there. Sullivan absorbed these ideas and carried them into his own practice, and from there they entered the bloodstream of American architecture. Sullivan is not as famous as the man he trained, but within the profession he remains foundational. He had arrived in Chicago as a young architect in the 1870s and built his reputation on commercial buildings, most notably the Auditorium Building, completed in 1889, just 2 years after Glessner House. Architectural historians have traced specific elements between the two. The way Sullivan concealed the main staircase of the Charnley House behind a wall, entering through a wide arch, appears to have been drawn directly from how Richardson handled the same problem at the Glessner residence. It was a small detail, but it told a larger story. Sullivan was watching. He was learning. And he was passing what he learned to the young draftsman in his office. That draftsman was Frank Lloyd Wright. He arrived at Adler and Sullivan in 1888, a 21-year-old from Wisconsin with no degree and enormous confidence. Sullivan became the only architect Wright ever publicly acknowledged as an influence. Wright called him Lieber Meister, beloved master. Given that Wright spent most of his career claiming his ideas were entirely his own invention, the admission was significant. What Wright took from Sullivan, and what Sullivan had absorbed from Richardson, was not a set of decorative motifs or a particular shape. It was an argument that a building should belong to its site, that the inside and the outside should answer each other, that ornament should come from structure, not be applied on top of it, that a house did not need to perform wealth for the neighbors. Every one of these ideas was visible at 1800 South Prairie Avenue before either Sullivan or Wright had built anything of consequence. Wright opened his own studio in Oak Park in 1893 and spent the next decade developing what became the Prairie style. The characteristics are now familiar: long lines that echo the flat Midwestern landscape, roofs that hang low over bands of windows, open floor plans that let rooms flow into each other, and a deliberate integration of interior space with the surrounding environment. When you line these features up against what Richardson had done at Glessner House, the line of descent is difficult to miss. The emphasis on the horizontal plane, the rejection of Victorian ornamentation, the idea that privacy and comfort matter more than display. Richardson had planted these seeds in a Chicago townhouse, and Wright grew them into an entire school of thought. The Roby House, built in 1909 on the south side of Chicago, is usually cited as the Prairie style's defining achievement. It sits low to the ground, its cantilevered roof extending outward in long, dramatic reaches, its windows organized in continuous bands rather than individual openings. It looks nothing like Glessner House on the surface. But the underlying logic is the same: inward orientation, functional separation of public and private space, a building that serves the people who live in it rather than the people who look at it. Richardson, Sullivan, and Wright are sometimes referred to as the recognized trinity of American architecture. The line runs from one to the next, each generation absorbing and transforming what came before. And while Richardson's most famous work remains Trinity Church in Boston, it was this house in Chicago, the last thing he ever designed, that carried the most forward. Wright never credited Richardson directly. That was not his style. But the evidence sits on the ground, carved in stone on one end of the city and stretched across a flat suburban lot on the other. The house that Pullman could not stand to look at quietly reshaped the way Americans would live for the next 100 years. Chapter 7. The Daughter Who Solved Murders in Miniature. When she was 15, Fanny Glessner built a miniature replica of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra for her mother's birthday. 90 musicians, each with an instrument, a music stand, and sheet music. She completed it in 2 months. Nobody saw it as training. It was a gift. But Fanny wanted more than crafts. She read Sherlock Holmes and was drawn to the stories that turned on small things. A scratch on a watch case, a misplaced shoe, a stain that should not have been there. She wanted to study medicine, or law. Something that would be, as she later put it, of value to the community. Her parents said no. A lady did not go to school. Her brother George went to Harvard. Fanny stayed home. It was George who brought home the person who changed everything. George Burgess McGrath was a Harvard classmate who spent summers with the family at their property in New Hampshire. He was studying pathology and would later become the chief medical examiner of Suffolk County in Boston. Over long summer evenings, McGrath told stories from his work. Real cases. How bodies revealed what had happened to them if you knew where to look. Fanny listened. She married at 19. Blewett Lee was a lawyer and a friend of George's. 3 children. The marriage did not last. By the time she divorced, she was in her 50s and widely seen as a rich woman with too much time on her hands. Then the deaths came in sequence. George in 1929, her mother in 1932, her father in 1936. Fanny was now the sole heir to the International Harvester fortune, and for the first time in her life, free to do exactly what she wanted. She went straight to Harvard. Even before her father's death, she had used part of her inheritance to establish the Department of Legal Medicine in 1931, first of its kind in North America. She donated $250,000 to endow it, worth well over $3 million today. She created the George Burgess McGrath Library of Legal Medicine and funded a professorship that McGrath himself filled. But the real problem was not the doctors. It was the police. Officers arriving at a scene of violent death had no training in how to read what they found. Evidence was stepped on, moved, or simply missed. Murderers went free because the first person through the door did not know what to look at. She could not bring detectives to real crime scenes. So she built her own. She started constructing them in the early 1940s. 20 dioramas she called the Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death. Each recreated a composite of actual cases at a scale of 1 inch to 1 foot. A kitchen with a body on the floor, an attic with a figure hanging from a rope, a bedroom where the sheets told a story the walls did not. Every detail functioned. The light bulbs worked. The doors opened. The blinds could be raised and lowered. She painted skin discoloration on the tiny figures to match the specific hues of carbon monoxide poisoning or blunt force trauma. She used dental tools to position the smallest objects. Each study cost between $3,000 and $4,500, roughly $40,000 to $60,000 today. She paid for all of it. The seminars began in 1945. Once or twice a year, Lee invited 30 to 40 detectives to Harvard for a week. They studied each diorama for 90 minutes, working in a clockwise spiral pattern she had devised. In the evenings, she hosted them at the Ritz-Carlton. Filet mignon. Errol Stanley Gardner, the creator of Perry Mason, attended and became a regular. He later wrote that a person could learn more about circumstantial evidence from 1 hour with her models than from months of study. The state of New Hampshire appointed her an honorary captain of its police force in 1943. First woman in the country to hold such a rank. Frances Glessner Lee died in 1962. She was 83. Hundreds of officers traveled from across the country to pay their respects. A few years later, Harvard dissolved the department. The dioramas went into storage and might have been lost if not for Russell Fisher, a former research fellow who had become the chief medical examiner of Maryland. He brought them to Baltimore, where they remain. They are still used in forensic training today, more than 80 years later. The Smithsonian displayed 18 of the 20 surviving studies at the Renwick Gallery in 2017. More than 100,000 people came to see them. A woman who was told she had no place in medicine ended up teaching the people who solved murders how to see. Chapter 8. The Son with the Camera. George Glessner had hay fever. It sounds minor. It shaped his entire life. The condition appeared early and hit hard enough that the family doctor told John and Frances to get the boy out of Chicago every summer. In 1878, when George was 7, they began traveling to the White Mountains, where the air was clean and his symptoms vanished. 4 years later, John purchased 100 acres of farmland and built a 19-room house on the property. They called it the Rocks. George spent every summer there from childhood through adolescence, and eventually he never left. But before that, he found a camera. By his early teens, George was developing photographs in a chemical laboratory he had set up in the basement of the Prairie Avenue house. He owned at least 3 different cameras over the years, and he used them relentlessly. Within the first year the family lived on Prairie Avenue, he documented every room, not casually, methodically. He labeled each photograph and each negative with descriptions of what was shown and where it was taken. He cataloged everything. The rooms were only the beginning. He photographed fire scenes and fire engines, trains, Chicago street life. He captured dozens of images of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, producing 35 platinum prints that survive in excellent condition at the Chicago History Museum. He took hundreds of views of the Rocks across multiple decades, recording the gardens, the outbuildings, the staff, the animals. By the early 1900s, he had switched from glass plate negatives to a film camera, and his images grew more candid. Children playing, family gathered on the porch, the small, unposed moments that formal portraiture would have missed. He graduated from Harvard in 1893. While there, he developed a close friendship with Rick Olmsted, the son of the landscape architect who had stayed in his parents' guest room. Mary Olmsted reportedly referred to George as her adopted son and gave him his own key to the family home. After college, George joined his father's firm as a purchasing agent and worked his way up to assistant manager. But his heart was in New Hampshire. In 1915, George and his wife Alice built a home on the Rocks property that they called The Ledge. He settled there permanently with their 4 children and took over management of the estate, which by then employed more than 70 people across a working farm with livestock, gardens, and timber. He ran the Bethlehem Electric Company. He managed the local power utility. He served 4 terms in the state legislature and played a central role in establishing New Hampshire as the site of the first presidential primary in the country. He was not a man who stayed idle, and he never stopped taking pictures. George contracted influenza while visiting his daughter in Paris in December of 1928. He appeared to recover, but appendicitis and pneumonia followed. He died on January 10, 1929. He was 57. His photographs outlived him by a margin he could not have imagined. When the preservation effort began in the 1960s, the people who saved the house had a problem. They could buy the building, they could solicit donations, but they could not know what the interior had looked like when the Glessner family lived there. Most of the original furnishings had been removed decades earlier. Rooms had been converted for industrial use. The wallpapers were gone. The arrangement of objects was lost. Then the family began returning things, and with those objects came George's archive, thousands of labeled photographs showing every room, every wall, every surface, exactly as it had been arranged in the 1890s. His images told the restorers where to place a chair, which wallpaper pattern belonged in which bedroom, how the light fell through specific windows at specific times of day. Without them, the restoration that visitors walk through today, 90% original to the Glessner period, would not have been possible. George Glessner did not know he was building a restoration manual. He was a young man with a camera, recording the place where he was happy. That turned out to be enough. Chapter 9. The Death of a Street. In 1929, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune walked down Prairie Avenue and described what she found. A caretaker guarded the empty, shuttered field mansion. The Armour House advertised furnished rooms. Chickens and ducks ran wild on the grounds of the Sherman property. Vacant lots had replaced homes that once cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. The street had not been destroyed by a single event. It had been emptied slowly, over 3 decades, by forces that no amount of money could reverse. The first blow came from an unlikely direction. Just a few blocks west, the Levee District had risen during the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 and never gone away. It was Chicago's most brazen vice quarter. Brothels, gambling parlors, and saloons operated under the open protection of local politicians, most notably a ward boss named Michael Kenna, known to everyone as Hinky Dink. The proximity was unbearable. Families who had built their homes to impress the world now lived within earshot of a district that wanted nothing to do with respectability. At the same time, the center of gravity for Chicago's wealthy was shifting. In 1882, Potter Palmer had built his castle on Lakeshore Drive, anchoring what would become the Gold Coast. His wife Bertha, the city's most powerful social figure, pulled other families northward simply by being there. Their children, raised on Prairie Avenue, saw no reason to stay when they married. They moved to Kenwood, Hyde Park, the North Shore suburbs, or the new apartments along the lake. The old houses, too large for a single couple and too expensive to maintain, sat empty. What replaced the families was worse than vacancy. By 1910, a medical school had set up in one of the former homes. A clinic for the treatment of drug and alcohol addiction occupied another. The Marshall Field Jr. Mansion, built for the department store heir who died under mysterious circumstances in 1905, passed through a series of institutional uses. Within a few years of his death, it housed a rehabilitation hospital, later a psychiatric facility. The most prestigious address in Chicago was absorbing the city's least glamorous functions. Commercial buildings began replacing homes as early as 1905. Loft buildings went up on Indiana Avenue. Printing companies, auto repair shops, and small manufacturers filled the gaps. No new residence was built on the street after 1904. The last mansion constructed in the district was already the last of its kind before anyone realized it. One by one, the landmarks fell. George Pullman's brownstone chateau, the one that had once been compared to the Grand Opera in Paris, was demolished in 1922, a few years after his widow died. Other houses followed through the 20s and 30s. Some were torn down for commercial lots. Others simply rotted. By the 1940s, much of the street was open fields, tenement housing, and small workshops. The Tribune had already called it the real ghost street of Chicago. The last original resident, a woman named Addie Hibbard Gregory, stayed in her home until 1944. After that, no one from the old families remained, except that one family had never left. John Glessner had died in the house in 1936, and his daughter had packed every piece of furniture and shipped it to New Hampshire. The building itself passed to institutions that had no use for a residential landmark. But unlike every other mansion on the street, it was not demolished. Not yet. By 1966, 7 of the original 90 houses were still standing. The rest were gone. And the one at the corner of 18th Street, the one the neighbors had once called a fortress, was about to be put up for sale. Chapter 10. $35,000. For nearly 20 years, there were printing presses where the parlor furniture used to be. Industrial equipment filled the rooms that had once held William Morris textiles and De Morgan tiles. The Lithographic Technical Foundation had leased the building from the Armour Institute in 1945 and converted it into a research facility for the printing industry. They left the floor plan intact, which saved the house structurally, but they had no interest in what it had been. The path to that point had been quick. After the last of the Glessners died, the house passed to the Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Architects under a deed of gift signed in 1924. The terms were clear. The building was to be used for the purposes of architecture and the allied arts. But maintaining a 17,000-square-foot residence during the Depression proved impossible, and within a year the architects returned it to the family. The heirs deeded it to the Armour Institute, which eventually became the Illinois Institute of Technology. Then came the printers. When the Lithographic Technical Foundation relocated to Pittsburgh in 1965, the house went up for sale. The asking price was $70,000. There were no buyers with any intention of preservation. On a street where nearly every original mansion had already been demolished, this one seemed destined to follow. Then Philip Johnson came to see it. Johnson, by then among the most prominent architects in the country, had been brought to the property by brothers Ben and Harry Wees. He walked through the empty rooms, studied the walls, looked at the proportions. Afterward, he called it the most important house in the country to him. The statement carried weight. When Philip Johnson said a building mattered, people listened. In April of 1966, 20 individuals signed a resolution creating the Chicago School of Architecture Foundation for the sole purpose of purchasing the house. Among them were the Wees brothers, the architectural historian Carl Condit, the Canadian architect Phyllis Lambert, and a young preservationist named Richard Nickel. They pooled their resources and offered $35,000, half the asking price. The offer was accepted. The sale closed in December. It was the beginning of something larger than any of them expected. The organization they created to save one building eventually grew into the Chicago Architecture Foundation, now one of the most recognized architectural education institutions in the country. The impulse to rescue a single house on a forgotten block had generated a movement. Richard Nickel did not live to see it fully take shape. 6 years after signing that resolution, he was inside another building that Chicago was tearing down. The Stock Exchange, designed by Adler and Sullivan in 1893, was being demolished despite protests from preservationists, historians, and even the mayor. Nickel had spent weeks salvaging ornamental fragments from the interior. On April 13, 1972, he went back alone. A section of the building collapsed on top of him. His body was not found for 4 weeks. He was 43. He once said that great architecture has only 2 natural enemies, water and stupid men. He is buried at Graceland Cemetery, not far from Louis Sullivan. The house he helped save fared better. Within a few years of the purchase, the Glessner descendants began sending things back. Furniture, decorative objects, journals, photographs. Room by room, the interior came together again, guided by the archive that one family had been careful enough to preserve. The house opened for public tours in 1971. It was designated a Chicago landmark in 1970, listed on the National Register of Historic Places the same year, and recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 1976. Today, visitors walk through rooms that look almost exactly as they did when the Glessners lived there. Most of what they see is original. The Morris wallpapers have been reproduced from surviving fragments. The Steinway sits in the parlor. The De Morgan tiles are back on the bedroom fireplace, retrieved from New Hampshire and driven to Chicago by the museum's curator. $35,000. That is what it cost to keep the last work of one of America's greatest architects from becoming a parking lot. George Pullman's mansion is gone. Marshall Field's is gone. Philip Armour's is gone. The Kimball house survived but changed hands and purpose. Of the families who once filled those 4 blocks with the largest concentration of private wealth in the Midwest, almost nothing physical remains, except the house they hated. It stands at the same corner where it stood in 1887, looking the same way it looked when the neighbors complained. The same stone face toward the street. The same hidden life behind it. Richardson designed dozens of buildings in his short career, and many of them survive. But this is the one he said he would have lived in. It is also the one that proved him right about everything his neighbors got wrong. That a building does not owe the street a performance. That comfort is not the same as display. That the best architecture answers to the people inside it, not the people passing by. Francis Glessner Lee's dioramas are still teaching detectives how to read a room. George's photographs are still guiding the placement of objects on shelves he once dusted as a boy. The journal Francis Macbeth Glessner kept for 40 years still provides the museum with stories it has not yet told. I think what strikes me most about this house is how patient it turned out to be. It waited out the neighbors. It waited out the vice district and the factories and the printing presses. It waited out the decades when nobody cared. And when people finally came back, it was ready. The door is still at ground level. There are still no stairs. You just walk in.